Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending Automation Hour today. I'm David Litton, and I'm just going to kick us off. If you could jump to the next slide, Matt. All right, so here's our schedule for some of the upcoming Automation Hours. As you can see, this will be our last one of January, and we have two scheduled for the month of February, just next week, and then a few weeks after that with Pete. And then we've got a pretty packed March with 3 sessions. Make sure you go. We'll have this slide posted to the Success Community page as well as on our website, Salesforce Automation Hour. And you can register with the links there for those additional webinars. All right, so for this webinar, all lines are going to be muted. We do have the chat function, so you can go down to where you see the questions and ask some questions. Rakesh, Jen, myself will be monitoring those as Matt is presenting. Some of the ones that will be quick and easy we'll answer immediately. Other ones we're going to wait till Matt's done, and we'll have a Q&A session after his presentation. We are recording this, so this will be posted afterwards, and you'll be able to go back to that if you had anything that you might have missed. And once again, our resources, we've got the Salesforce Automation Hour community on the Success Community, as well as our website. It says salesforceautomationhour.com here. It's also Automation Hour, so that's our new domain, so either one works. And this wouldn't be possible without our sponsor Concrete.io, so we just want to thank them as always for sponsoring this webinar and their support of it from the beginning. And here is Jen, Rakesh, and I at Dreamforce. We're the co-hosts for these webinars, and then for today we have the one and only Matt O'Hare.
Thanks, David. Thanks for the great introduction. This is a picture of me. As you can see, I'm looking pretty proud of myself. I remembered to shave on picture day and get a haircut. I was asked before this presentation if I could give some of my social media creds, but since I'm somewhat of a social media Luddite, I don't really have them. I've quit in order to pursue just studying Salesforce visual workflow in a monastic setting and concentrating on nothing else. But I do have a Red Argyle website link here, and one of our co-founders, Gary, is a longtime MVP, and we've got his Twitter handle and Red Argyle's Twitter handle here. And I do want to take a brief pause before I get started to just say that I'm relatively new to Red Argyle, and I got this position in large part, I think, due to my experience with visual workflow. I volunteered to do a presentation at a local Salesforce user group, and I got up and described some automation I built for my last company for setting up new users and deactivating them, similar to some of what Jennifer talked about in her recent blog post, doing some automation to add people to chatter groups and send out welcome emails and stuff like that. So thanks to Jennifer, David, and Rakesh kind of indirectly, because I've definitely leaned on their expertise and a lot of the content that they've posted before on their blogs and in the automation and in the success community. And that visual workflow this is probably a great audience to say that can really be a step up or a stepping stone for your career if you're looking for something different, or a great resume builder if you just want to keep building your skill set. All right. Oh, I should point out the one social media credential I do have, somewhat embarrassingly, is Untapped. It's just for a social beer drinking website, so feel free to look me up on that. All right, so I'm sure most people have heard of Red Argyle before. If you haven't, if there's one or possibly two people on the call that haven't heard of Red Argyle, you can basically think about us like Dutch's elite crack squad of commandos from Predator, plus significantly more gender diversity, and instead of camouflage, we wear red Argyle socks. All right, so this is us, our little promo slide. All right, so on to today's presentation. So I posted a little quick blurb in the success community online. I don't know if you guys saw that, but this use case is about using Salesforce as a kind of integration platform or middleware, and you may be thinking, all right, so what does that mean? Probably a bunch of you have used this kind of thing before, but just again, in case anybody else has not seen any of this type of application in whatever environment you're in, there's often a use case in which you've got some external system with data and you want to get that data into Salesforce in one way or another. And there are a number of players already out there in this space. Jitterbit, Workato, and Zapier are three that Red Argyle has used in the past before. I just recently myself set up a Workato integration with QuickBooks. And what happens is, you want to get data from one place into another. And I don't want to overstate the case and say that Salesforce can do what these applications can do, because they're very much more robust and good at things like error checking and doing all kinds of complicated logic. What we have is something somewhat a little bit more straightforward, simple, 1, 2, 3. But this is the concept, and Salesforce, of course, has its Salesforce Connect, a tool that they've been promoting a lot recently and building out a lot. That can do a lot of great things just in real time, integrating data from an external system into Salesforce. All right, so here's our story. Here's what happened. It was actually shortly after I'd started at Red Argyle, we got a client that came to us and said, we have this sort of beast of a process that we have to do every month. We've got this finance team that's got to take some data, and they've got to do a whole bunch of manipulations. It just takes hours and hours, and it's just massive. Can you guys help us out? Yes is the answer, probably. There's a lot of caveats here to this presentation, so just bear with me with these. I tried to insert some animations, pretty advanced, I know. So here's the situation, the scenario as it existed for the client. They said, all right, so what happens is we take a traditional Salesforce report and we export it. Then we copy the whole thing, and then we paste it into a gigantic, an Excel template. And then we get the report from some external system, and we do a little bit of manipulation there. We take that report, and then we copy that stuff into the template as well. And then we upload the completed template after it does its automatic formula data manipulation, and then we import it to update existing records in Salesforce. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, that seems pretty straightforward. I don't see what's so bad about that. And it is actually not overly complex in the steps that are involved, but I could go into a dark place as I go back and think about the forensics and the time that we spent trying to pick apart what was happening in this massive Excel file. And I've never seen anything like it before. It was formulas upon formulas, copied 50,000 rows deep into the sheet, and it literally took us, well, it crashed Excel, OpenOffice, and Google Sheets, all of those. And the client said that it took upwards of 20 minutes just to open this template file, let alone to copy and paste. So it was pretty difficult to find out what was going on. But eventually we did. We went back and forth with the client a number of times, and we discovered that what was happening after a whole bunch of manipulation of dates and looking up of data here and there is that the source system basically had an order number and a date, and that matched up with a set of records in Salesforce that had that same order number and a date on a parent record. So this was our key. I couldn't even describe to you if you asked me how that happened in this massive template file that I was just describing. But eventually we figured this out, and we thought, can this be done? Well, first I should say our initial instinct was to go with something like Jitterbit. Jitterbit's very, very good at this kind of thing. You can just take a report and just drop it somewhere, and then it'll just go and do its thing. But as we figured this out, my new boss, Gary, came to me and said, can it be done via flow? And it can, sort of. All right, so what we're doing is essentially taking this, or the idea is if we can take this process, some external system and then some middleware, and then piping data into Salesforce, we can simplify it and simplify it again, and basically we're just doing it all within Salesforce. And maybe this is kind of stating the obvious, but there are some benefits if this is possible, and one of them is that we don't have a house of cards. We don't have three systems talking to each other. if something changes in the source system, then you have to change something in how your middleware works with the source system. Then you might have to change something with how Salesforce processes that data. So what we can do, if it's all within Salesforce, is we can just have a flow that we update if something changes. The other benefit is just that there's cost reduction. If it's native Salesforce functionality, we don't have to pay for some middleware client. And it's just really more straightforward and a little bit faster to work with. All right. Oh, that must be a leftover from previous presentation. Here we go. The concept, a new formula field on the target object. All right. So basically, we have an existing set of records in Salesforce that need to be updated with, let's call it an invoice field, invoice data. And we're going to call that the target object. So we're going to create a new formula field on that target object, the existing data in Salesforce, that's going to concatenate the order number and the month from this related record, and thus creating the key on one set of records. And we're going to create a custom object that's going to be a sort of temporary object, a bag of holding, to hold the records that we're uploading from the external system source report. And if we do our job well, we can delete those records when we're done doing everything that we've got to do. And then Process Builder is our, as probably most people on this call know, Process Builder is our lookout. It's looking out for newly created records. And then it's going to go launch a flow, and then it's going to say, all right, let's find a bunch of records that are related to the records we just uploaded and update those records. All right. All right, so before I got started, I was running this process by our other co-founder, Tom, and I said, all right, so here's the concept. What do you think? How do you think this is going to work? Do you foresee any problems? And he said, well, the first one is that we're searching against millions of records, and there's some very specific considerations that you have to keep in mind when you're doing that. Salesforce optimizes its search database in a few different ways, and you have to be really aware of how you're doing that, because when you search against 8 million records and you look against a field that is non-indexed, our formula field is necessarily non-indexed because Salesforce does not allow you to index formula fields because they can change so dynamically. What we have to do is copy our key field into an external ID field, which is an indexed, automatically indexed field. Any external ID field that you create will be indexed by a process builder. And I also had to do some bulk data uploads with data loader in order to get our 8 million, we had actually 8 million records we were looking up against. So I had to do some data loader work to update the existing records and then set up another process builder process that would say anytime a new target object record is created, grab the formula field and copy it into the external ID field. All right, I've provided a link down here to Salesforce's search optimization cheat sheet. Pretty cool stuff. I won't pretend I understand it all, but it looks pretty cool and it's pretty impressive. All right, where are we here? Nope, that wasn't supposed to. Okay, so here's our flow. If anybody's done a loop before, you'll notice that this is pretty much the smallest possible loop that you can do. Right, so this is really straightforward. I felt like a genius when I put this together. I thought this is super duper efficient. This, he said dramatically, is definitely going to work. All right, so starting from the top left, we look up the report line. This is the temporary object that we've uploaded our external systems report to. The process builder grabs the ID and gives it to us. Then we go up and look up our target objects. We say, all right, how many target objects have this key field that we're matching against? If we didn't find any, we're just going to go ahead and delete that line item, because what happens is out of the source report we might have 3,000 lines. It might only be 100 or 200 of those that are new, right? So the rest of them were updated the previous month or the month before that. So we didn't find anything, we just delete our temporary item with a record delete. If we did find some beans, we go ahead and we grind them through the loop. We say assign the invoice number from the temporary object to the target object, and then we add it to a new collection, and then we go through it again and again, and then we go, when we're all done, we come out of the loop, we update all of our beans, and then we delete our source report or temporary object record items. We thought, okay, this is great. Let me see if I can go into our flow here. All right, where is it? Here it is. So I'll just click through the screen so everybody can see them. I guess I should have been doing this while I was describing it a second ago. So we look up the bean report. This is our report that shows us how many beans were ground in the previous month, how many new beans we have. and we look for, so we grab our record out of our 3,000 records that we uploaded into our temporary object. We grab our ID, and we look up some additional fields there. We say, where did it come from? What's the invoice number? What's our key? There might be a few additional fields that we're looking up and updating on the target object as well. Then we go and we say, look up our target object. We find all of them. So we use a fast lookup. We find as many records as possible. It could be 1, it could be 50, it could be 100. So find all the beans whose key equals that key. And then we added a couple other criteria just so we could minimize the number of records that we're looking at. Created date is another automatically indexed field. So we're gonna make it just so it's looking at this year's beans. It's not or ones. In the real world, I did 365 days ago. And then we're going to say, make sure we also only return ones where there's a blank invoice. So we're basically limiting our search results. Okay. All right, and then store them in a collection variable. And then if we found any, there's our decision element. If we didn't find them, we're just going to be super efficient and go and clean up after ourselves. But if we did, we're going to go through the beans one by one, assign them through to a loop variable, and we're going to loop through those, and we're going to say, pop that invoice number in there from our temporary object, and then we add them to a new collection, a new secondary S-object collection, and then at the very end, as we finish our loop, we come out and we update that new S-object collection, and we're all done. Everything looks great. All right. All right, and David made a good point when I was describing this to David and Jennifer and Rakesh on the call. He brought up a really cool website I hadn't seen before. It's called Makaroo. I just took a screenshot of their pricing. I should have taken a screenshot of how the data looks. But basically, you can create large sets of test data for doing pretty much what I was doing. I was lucky enough here to be working in a full sandbox, so I had literally 8 million records, and I could just grab a set of them, modify them with data loader, and then test at will. But if you're not that lucky, if you're working in a developer box, you don't have a ton of records, it's a great way to set up a test data set that you can work with, upload, download, and update. So I don't know if Parker's on the call today. Parker's presentation a couple weeks ago, he did bring up some stuff about limits. So Parker's thinking, wait a minute, if you can have thousands of records that you're uploading, and then those can go look at 8 million, what if you run into way more records than you're expecting? And that is a very good point. And he brought up the same thing, the same set of limits, and I think the particular one when you're working with loops is 2,000 steps. So each time you go through the loop, it counts as another sort of step in the flow. And Parker would say, told you. He would say, I knew this was going to happen, and it did. So what happened is we stopped at that point. We'd given a set of test data to the client. We said, all right, go into the sandbox and start working with some stuff. So we had a set of test data the client provided us, and in that set of test data, the maximum number of records that we found that we were updating at a time was usually between 30 and 50. Right? So when the client went back in to do some more comprehensive testing with this overly simplistic flow that I had designed at first, they did with some other more recent sets of data, and we ran into this error. All right, so maximum number of iterations exceeded. So what are we going to do? We're going to count the beans. We're going to stop, and we're going to look, and we're going to say, where are we before we go and we update thousands and thousands of beans at a time? All right, so we've got a slight modification to a flow, still very, very efficient. I posted a link here, and I think I put one on the next slide as well, about how to wait for less than an hour. And why do we want to wait? We want to wait because inserting a wait element, also a screen, if you don't have an auto-launch flow, will allow your transaction count to be reset. So you've got 2,000 elements is your max number of elements in a flow. So if you insert a wait element and you don't want to wait an hour because that's the minimum that Salesforce out of the box allows, you can use this, and I show the formula on the next slide. But what we essentially want to do is we want to count the number of elements, and then we want to find a way to make sure it's less than 2,000. So you can see I built a super simple formula over there on the right side. We've got 4 elements in our loop. So we've got the first assignment, we've got the second assignment, we've got the decision, plus the loop element itself. That's a total of 4. So I just guesstimated 475 times 4, and then you add in your additional elements, the weight, the updates, the lookups, and you end up with 1907. That should give us plenty of room. All right, so let me hop out here for a second and hop into the next version, because, yes, that was a little foreshadowing there. You can see that there is a third version. In the second version here, though, what I want to show is that our counter, let's see if I added it here. Might not have done this in this demo version of it. There it is. Var counter add 1. So you can sort of reuse your existing assignment element to update your counter variable. So this counter variable is just something explicit or private to the flow itself, and it's just a number with 0 decimals, and essentially we're just saying the default value is 0. And so we increment that here. Then we still do our adding to the new collection, and then here we count the beans. Do we say, is it 475, or here I have 500? And if it is, if it's up towards that limit that we're looking at, then we go into the weight element, and then we do our fast update, and then we sort of start again. And because we've limited our lookup to items that don't have an invoice number, we'll only be looking up the target object records that have not been fixed in the last fast update. All right, so pretty straightforward. We just added another little section in there, but kind of smart. Again, thought I was super smart and intelligent. I totally thought this was going to work. And drum roll, please. Oh yeah, here's our formula. And Eric's Playground has a lot of really cool posts about what interesting stuff that he's done with Salesforce. This one, where it says 58 is the minutes in the hour. So I'm actually waiting for 2 minutes instead of 1 minute. But if you wanted to wait for just 1 minute, you'd change that 58 to a 59. All right. So what we did with the formula field is we placed this formula field on the temporary object, where we're uploading our records from the external system. And it calculates this time, and then in the wait element, we wait for this time plus 1 hour. So 58 minutes ago plus 1 hour ends up being 2 minutes from now. All right, so I was going to wait 2 minutes, reset the transaction limit, and then go grab another batch. And then we got the elusive, the never-before-seen Salesforce error large. And I kid you not, this is the error as it comes out of Salesforce, and this came to my email. The interview is large to be saved. I would be really curious to find out if anybody else on this call has ever seen that error. I was surprised to see it. I did a little quick search right after that through some various different types of keyboards, QWERTY, Azerty, Dvorak, and even Inuktitut, and none of them have the L right beside the T. I was surprised to find out. So it seems like an odd typo to be made. So it's either an Easter egg or there really is a large somewhere, and the interview is large to be saved. So at this point, I was the client had signed off on all previous tests. We'd done more tests. We'd moved everything over to production. Everything actually looked really good, and I thought we were in great shape. And then they tested with a real set of data. I think it was January, and this happened, the error. So we were able to correct the records that did not get updated. But this was when I was giving my presentation to Jennifer, Rakesh, and David, and I was sort of crestfallen. I had gone from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows, thinking, man, this is going to be really disappointing. They're going to have to get another presenter because my whole use case isn't working. But Jennifer, David, and Rakesh, being the gracious hosts that they are, they said, you know what, each of them had also run into a situation where Flow couldn't do exactly what it was that they had intended for it to do. So they said, you know what, there's still some good data in here, there's some good points, there's some neat ideas that other people can get some takeaways from. Whether it's, we've got talked about the search part, the search optimization, um, third-party integrations. Salesforce, Flow could do this in smaller data sets if you're not searching against 8 million records and updating tens, thousands at a time. And I also wanted to point out validation rules are important. If one record fails and Flow is trying to update 500, all 500 are going to stop. So you want to make sure you don't have any validation rules affecting the data that or that you account for the validation rules affecting the data that you're trying to update. And I also put a link down here at the bottom to the Salesforce app limits cheat sheet. There's a ton of limits for Flow. I've learned a lot about them recently myself. So, I mean, at this point, I thought, all right, I'm cooked. That's it. It's done. It's going to be the most, the least satisfying presentation of the whole set of presentations. And I thought that was the end. I thought this is surely the end. Look, it says the end all over the place here. This is definitely the end. But I had something happen. I don't know if it was that night or the night after I presented to our hosts. And if any of you have ever sat and worked on a flow as you're getting to know things and you're trying to figure out a puzzle, sometimes you go home and, late at night, 3 in the morning, or the next day in the shower, you figure out, maybe, what if I tried this? What if I tried that? And that's what happened to me. So what I did was I changed a couple of things around. I tried a couple more things, and I got it to work. I was really trying to animate this in the style of the Star Wars opening credits. I did not have time, so I apologize for that, everybody. But what I did was, first I switched around. I thought the Lou Large seemed to be saying that the weight element, the data was Lou Large for the weight element. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll just do the update first, and then I'll go into the weight element. Long story short, that didn't work. So then I thought, why don't I just dramatically reduce the batch size? Instead of trying for the ceiling, instead of trying for the max number of records that I can possibly process at a time, why don't I just try for a much smaller set of records? And that was it. That was the trick. So I reduced my batch size to 50. Then I update the batch. Then I wait, just in case I end up going through this 10 or 15 times for our 800 or 1,000 records. We wait a minute. Then we go look up some more beans. We find them. We grind the beans. We go through it. We find another 50. We loop. It's basically another larger set of loops outside the loop. And in the case of where you're updating about 1,000 records at a time, it gets a little clunky. You do have to wait for a couple minutes here, a couple minutes there, and it might take, half an hour to get out of everything. But what we do have is the benefit of being able to, you can see which records are left over. You can go see your pending flow interviews, and you can see your records that are left to be updated. And if anything fails in here, you do still have those leftover records that didn't get deleted, your temporary object records. So that's it. That's the quick version. I'm only up to a half an hour. I'm probably talking too fast or didn't go slowly enough through some things. So I can go through the final version of the flow. I copied it into my own dev org, and we can take a look at that if you want, or we could go to some questions. What do you think, David?
I think we got some time for probably the dev work, and then we can do that for about 10 or so, or however long that is, and then jump into some questions. If everyone wants to start thinking of some questions they have, then we can have that all queued up and ready to go.
Okay. All right, so this is it. It's really not any different than what we had before. All we did was we swapped the weight and the fast update, and we changed the number of beans in the bean counter to 50. All right, I don't know if this is going to take 10 minutes. I was worried that this presentation would be a little bit quick. I guess I could show us the records. Again, this is just a mock-up of the real data. but a bean has a date and it has a batch number, and so the batch key is a concatenation of the two. For reasons too long to go into now and dry and boring, I won't tell you why I converted the date into the full spelled out month, but it did actually end up working pretty well. It was something to do with the source data from the original system, but it did end up working pretty well to create a key. So here's a bean without an invoice. So this is one that would be pulled in from our fast lookup. I guess in an ideal situation, I would have had thousands of records that we could look at. But here's our temporary object data, and we have a row state, an order number, and we have a key. So it's the order number and the date together makes the key. Oh, this should have an invoice number in it right here. All right, so there's our two objects, and what happens is when something's loaded into the second object, the temporary object, the bean report object, we notice that happened. All we do is jump right into the flow, and we pass the flow the ID of one of the line items. So this might be a total of 3,000, but the limit there I think is 10,000. I think Salesforce can have up to 10,000 paused or waiting interviews, and we've definitely stress tested this, so this can have a ton. You can load in 3,000 records and it just crunches through them, putting any that require waiting into the pause and pending interview flow, pending flow interviews. All right, then it jumps in here. I think I showed this before. Goes through its updates. I don't see any questions, so is this the shortest automation hour so far?
Yeah, we've got some questions. I'll
okay. Oh, I see the question
first
section.
one, the question tab there. But where does the original bean report live? Is that first element looking at an outside source?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question, and I forgot to really cover that. The bean report is a custom object, so it's a new custom object that I created, and the process for I didn't really get to flesh this out for the demo, but the process is somebody emails that from the external system to somebody at our client, and our client saves that to their desktop and goes into the data import wizard. And let's see, launch wizard. And we'd find a custom object. So we're dumping data into our temporary object. We want to add new records and trigger workflow rules and processes for new updated records. I should definitely add this to the slide. I didn't really think about this section for the presentation. So you just drag your CSV file here to upload, and then in the next screen, what I did was I named the bean report fields the exact same name as the fields that came over from the external system. So there's no matching involved. It just automatically knows match field A to field 1 and field B to field 2, etc. And you click next, and it does a bulk upload from here of 3,000 or so line items into your temporary object. All right, next question.
All right, next question is the integration nuance here just the handoff of data from an internal object to from an external object, and is the external created by data loader or other connection to the third-party system?
If I understand the question, yes, the integration is just load some data into Salesforce and do some stuff with it. The original ask from the client was just, we have this data coming in, and it's unmanageable, the current process. So we don't have to, it's not a two-way street, it's just a one-way street. We're just loading stuff into Salesforce and then processing it. So that, yes, that is the sum total of the integration, and that is why it works in this scenario. We're not taking data out from Salesforce and doing something else with it. Flow obviously couldn't do that. Flow can obviously only manipulate data inside Salesforce. I'm sure there are some caveats there. And what was the second part of the question, David?
Is the external created by data loader or other connection to the third-party system?
The external data it's exported on a monthly basis by our client's client. So they have some client that they work with that needs some data to come back out of Salesforce. They need to match up their records with our client's records. So they, on a monthly basis, run a report and mail it to our client. So in this case, the data import wizard is being used to create records in a temporary object that are then deleted. So we're taking external data and basically copying the important bits of it into Salesforce records that we then use to update other Salesforce records before we delete our temporary records.
Yeah, Bruce, let me know if that doesn't solve or answer your question, and I can unmute you and maybe have you, ask it through a mic if you prefer. Um, okay, awesome. All set there. So
Okay.
we've got another question here. Can I create records from a flow in bulk from any decision boxes onward?
I believe that the answer would be using a fast create element. I have not yet had to do that myself, but um, you would have to have a set of data with the fields that you need to create a ton of records. Do you have any other suggestions or ways to answer that, David?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure on the question, so maybe follow up if we
Sure.
didn't answer correctly. But my understanding would just be yes, you can create records in bulk with Flow, but be mindful, as was covered on this presentation as well as the last one with Parker, of the limitations that you have, because um, if something scales past what it is today to a level that's not supported, in terms of like the number of elements a flow can have is 2,000. So if you're doing, a fast create where you have to create your collection inside the flow, that kind of limits you to anything over a few hundred records. You can't start working with thousands of records at once. So just keep in mind, the limits of your flow there. But yes, you can definitely create multiple records at once. And as Matt said, you want to use a fast create so that it's more efficient.
Yeah, that's a good point, but I can't think of any situation where you'd be able to use Flow to create that like a large number like you're talking about of records that all have different data. If you're grabbing the data from one place and using it to update the data in another place, then yes, but if you're manipulating the data inside the flow, then it's going to get really cumbersome and next to impossible.
Yep. Yeah, that caused me to write some Apex this week for that
Okay.
pretty much exact reason. So sometimes you just got to move out of flow and into some code. All
All right,
right,
now that I
next.
finally,
Oh,
sorry,
sorry, go
you go
ahead.
ahead. I was going to say, now that I found the question section, we're going to read the one from Michael Cummins.
Yeah,
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And
I'll read it real quick so everyone knows what we're about to answer.
yeah, good point, good point.
When you upload a large number of records, say 3,000, are you concurrently running 3,000 business processes and flows, all filtering the same records? Are there any issues with access to those records by concurrent flows?
I guess I would say that yes, you're correct. You are concurrently running 3,000 processes, and they just, I guess, due to the nature of the way Salesforce works, there's going to be some overlap. But I think what happens is they're all compartmentalized because they're each just doing lookups to pull data back, and each one of them will be manipulating a separate set of data that it returns. Right, so there's going to be, for a given record that's uploaded in our temporary object, there's only going to be a very specific set of data that matches that record's search. The next record that's uploaded into the temporary object is going to return a different set of beans without invoices that have this particular key. There's never going to be an overlap on the key. So while there's a lot of processes happening at the same time, we do still manage to be under the limits, and they don't overlap in the records that they're working with. but that would be a very good consideration. If you have multiple flows running concurrently and they're working with the same set of data, then I'm sure, yes, you'd run into some problems. I think I have actually run into that error before. I couldn't obtain exclusive access to a record, I think is what you'll see.
Yes. So Michael asked, or kind of followed up. So the matches are all unique. So yeah, and that's one of the things that you'll notice. You know, a drawback of Flow as opposed to writing some Apex is that you don't have as much control over, you know, the bulk imports. You know, if you are doing a data load, you're going to be able to optimize it a lot more with Apex than you would with Flow. But you know, a lot of the times, as long as the flow is working, it's probably not going to, you know, cause a ton of performance issues to where anybody but the admin doing the data load is going to notice. Especially if it's something that you have set up to like run at 2 a.m. That's not really going to, you know, mess with an end user, but definitely, you know, something to keep in mind.
Right. Yeah. And I see Randy had asked a question that maybe I clarified at the same time. Randy said, if the original report has 8 million rows, how do you load it using data loader? And just to clarify, the source report from the external system has somewhere between 3 and 5,000 rows, not 8 million. So it's the target object records that has the 8 million rows that we had to index. So that's what we're searching against. We're not loading that 8 million. We're only loading about 3,000 at a time.
All right. Any other questions? Doesn't have to be, you know, related to this particular webinar that we just saw from Matt. It can be, you know, other Salesforce automation type questions.
I should also point out, thanks Gary, that it's there's no underscore in Gary's Twitter handle, just at Darth Gary. Thanks, boss. I think Lori's typing a question right now.
Lori, can you type the first part of that question again? It accidentally got deleted.
When getting a
Unless
process builder flow error, they refer to API names that aren't visible. Any tips? Process builder flow error. If I can guess about what you're asking about, I think in some cases you have a process builder that references a flow, and the process builder error will just say a flow failed to execute. But then what you should get is a second error from the flow if the flow is what caused the problem. So I think because they're kind of in walled gardens, the process builder doesn't know why the flow failed. All it knows is that it tried to do a flow and it didn't get a result at the end that it was happy with. So it said something happened. But when that happens to me, I always get a second email with more details from the flow. Is that what you're referring to, Lori? Well, this may not be. What about errors that are 100% within Process Builder? I can say from experience that in some cases, when you're this is an answer specific to Flow. You can create, and you can find this on the Success community and elsewhere. I think maybe even Salesforce documentation. You can create a text template which gathers variables from your flow, and then use that, or maybe you can just enter the variables themselves in the name of the flow, so that if you have maybe a whole bunch of pending stuff, like if you're loading a bunch of records in and they're all doing what I was just describing, you can see which record, or you can see which variables were set in which way, and sometimes that can give you a little bit more information. It's called the interview name. But errors that are 100% within Process Builder, I have to say I'm kind of frustrated by that as well because you get these sort of generically named elements in the process builder, like step A1 underscore 1 or something like that. And they probably align to the order of the nodes, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, going from top to bottom. But
until you rearrange them, and then after you rearrange them, you have a little bit of a nightmare.
is that exactly how it works, David?
Yeah, so they get created. So let's say you created five, different criteria for your process builder, and then you decided that you wanted to move number five to the first spot. Now, if your error happens, it might say number five, but that would actually be your first criteria. So it's not, to my
Right.
knowledge, it doesn't do any sort of renaming of those variables after you rearrange it. But I might be wrong. That might be have been updated since I last ran into that.
Yeah, that's a good question. It'd be nice if they just improved their error messages, but something I kind of want to go and play around with. I wonder if you clone it or do a new version or something like that, if it would rename those for you. But I don't know, Lori. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for that.
Matt, do you see Bruce's question around paused flows?
Hunting down pause flows. If you trigger a future action, how to give yourself some breadcrumbs. Oh, so that's what I was just talking about, the elements. I had another situation I was working with recently that could end up with a number of different pause flows waiting for things from a number of different records. And that's that giving your flow interview a name and filling it with useful variables. So you'll see, when you look at your paused flow interviews, you see just a list with a bunch of stuff that's not really helpful, but adding in a variable like the name or the ID of the record that you're currently working with, or some choice that was input by the user, will definitely help you troubleshoot those paused flows. I also did something, I might have seen this on a blog somewhere. If you're doing a whole bunch of testing and you end up with a whole bunch of paused flows, it's kind of useful to make yourself a quick flow to delete paused flows. So that's a fun one that you can find out on the blog somewhere. Is it possible to chatter at mention a user who is following a parent record whenever a specific child record is created? This would go for any user following this parent record. They each would get at mentioned on the parent feed. I guess I'd have to know more about what you mean by a specific child record is created, but it seems very possible. If you might have a counter there as well. You might have a roll-up summary of the number of child records, and if that changes, then you can post a message to Chatter and grab the details of the most recent record. What do you think
Yeah,
about that one,
you'd have to
David?
use some flow for that, just because you'd be, working. I mean, I guess you probably could, with invocable processes, do it within Process Builder. But if you're going to want to do it cleanly, I'd probably say, Flow or Apex. Um, but I would also check out, Doug Ayer's blog. He's got a lot of stuff around Chatter. So even if his one of his ChatterBot posts doesn't apply directly to this particular question, it should at least give you a good idea of the differences for Process Builder, Flow, and Apex, and some of the API stuff for what's possible within Chatter. Because depending on which tool you use, there's going to be some different levels of functionality that you have available to yourself. And I'll
Yeah, I did
reply
see that
back to your
Chatter.
question with that blog post.
Yeah, I saw that ChatterBot post recently. I haven't checked it out yet. So
Uh,
Michael had another question. Has anyone played with the idea of using business process to replace some flow functions? My idea and point is relating all records on an object to a parent record so that you can then filter all records on an object and update some of those records by using update records related to the record that started this process. In this case, you are filtering the related list of the parent. I don't understand. It's a detailed question, but I don't totally follow that one. I'm sorry, Michael. Maybe you could repost it in the community and give an example or a screenshot of what you're trying to achieve.
I think what Michael's asking might be, why not use some of the process builder update all records as opposed to sending it into a flow and using it that way. Um, and I think it definitely has its place when the process builder works for that. I think it's really kind of a use case by use case, which one fits, the business process as a whole that you're trying to solve. Because sometimes it might be as simple as just one update. Other times you might be doing something a little bit more complex. And typically when it's something more complex, I'd rather just send it to one flow as opposed to having like tons of different process builders spread out everywhere. But it really just comes down to, what you're comfortable and what the, use case is, I think, for whether you go that route or flow. But that doesn't
Yeah, I will
answer,
tell you
throw
from
it in the success community.
yeah, and I will also add to that I have recently done something where I was forced to move a whole bunch of what I had in Flow out to Process Builder, and there are benefits and drawbacks. Process Builder doesn't have the flexibility that Flow has, and so I had to instead of doing branching logic, I had to do very explicit logic. So a Process Builder node says A and B and C, but not 1 and not 2, but also 3, or something like that. You'd be very, very explicit in one node because you want it to only go down that node in a very specific use case, whereas, and then you have to do that for 7 or 10 nodes in Process Builder, whereas Flow could make a decision at the top, and then depending on the first decision, give you some subsequent decisions which could inform your logic. So um, it can be possible to do the same thing, but not as flexible in the long run. But then again, you do have the benefit of Process Builder being much more approachable by people that don't know how to use Flow. And if you're only updating one automation, whatever you want to call it, one type of automation, that sometimes can be a little bit easier to manage than having to update Process Builder and Flow if you're using them both.
All right, what do we do when a process keeps failing because of all or none error? Basically, we have a record with related cases, and we update all related cases when the record status closes. But it's failing the update, and it seems to be because the data hitting validation rules. Does this make sense? Has anyone run into something like this? So it sounds like a scenario that I've run into a lot of times where you have a validation rule, whether it's an apex validation rule or just a standard one that's causing an error. And yeah, the all or none. If you're trying to update 7 cases that are child cases, and one of them has a missing field that's required before it can be closed, then you either need to update your validation rule or do something else inside of your process builder to first update other values that might be required, or something else to kind of bypass that, because that's one of those things with Flow. When you do hit a validation rule, you're kind of out of luck.
Yeah, I will add on to that. I mean, that's exactly what I was going to say. But what you once you've, assuming that you don't have a list of 15 or 20 or 50 validation rules for one object, what you can do is build in error checking to your flow. And I was thinking about doing this with the process that I just described. So you basically, if you find out what the validation rules are, you can say pull back your list of records, and then you can say loop through the records, and if there's any that don't have email addresses, remove them. Or, I mean, the only other option really is to turn off the validation rules before you're doing whatever you're supposed to be doing, but obviously that's not sustainable in the long run. So add in some kind of error checking to your flow if you can. I was thinking about doing that for this process when we found out that certain lines were duplicated but with different keys, that there was only 1 or 2 of those. Or there was also a summary row at the bottom of the data that we were updating or uploading into the temporary object. So when we tried to send the data in, it had blank fields for what we were trying. It was counted as a row in the object we were trying to upload it to, but it had just blank fields. And then so when it did a search against 8 million records, looking for basically looking for all of them, it rolled back because it found too many records. That was a search optimization error. So the client ended up deciding to clean up the data on the way in, do a couple of checks and balances before doing the upload, which made it kind of easier. But I was imagining ways to check for and correct those errors with the data before it was loaded in. You could, I mean, sorry, one more thing. You could actually have a subflow at the beginning of your flow that just says, you know, before you do whatever you're supposed to do, go check against all these records and look for this thing, this thing, this thing, this thing, and either correct them or remove them from the set of data that you're looking at. And Eric added, I set a flow in my process builders and check that in validation rules. Set a flow flag. Oh, that's a great idea. Yeah. So if your object can have an additional checkbox added to it, set it as you start your process, and then unset it, I guess, at the end, and have your validation rule not care about things that records that have that checkbox checked. That's a great idea.
All right, we've got just a few minutes left. If there are any other questions, if anything comes up after this webinar, once again, you can go to the Success community and find Salesforce Automation Hour there and post your questions there. We'll also be posting the webinar recording as well as the slide deck after this webinar is over.
All right, thanks, David. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for attending today, and I'll see you on the Success community.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Bye.